So, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about really quickly is the use of quotations. I very often see quotations mishandled in student writing, and I think it's just because no one's explained um, how to use them to you before. So, hey, hi, it's me. The first thing I want to just talk about is that you need to only use quotations when they're worth using. So don't just throw them in as filler. Don't directly quote words when, let's just say it's a statistic or something. You actually only want to use a quotation when you have a reason to use the quotation. For example, if the language that you see used in the passage is particularly elegant, powerful, or memorable. So if you read it and you're like, yeah, that's just well said, then use it as a direct quote. Sometimes you want to tap into the authority of the person who has said the words. So basically, you're lending that person's authority to the argument that you're making. So then you can pull in their words to kind of back you up. Sometimes there's just something that's been said in writing, and you want to go in there and kind of pick it apart and point to certain things. In which case, yes, of course, use the quote. Or maybe you want to use a quote from someone so that you can see their position laid out and then you can argue with it or present the countering view. So, first thing with a quote is make sure you really need to use it. But here now we're getting into this issue that I see often in writing that I want to make sure you've got clear in your head. In terms of using quotations. So let's say you have a short quotation, like part of a sentence or a sentence. I want you to know that you always have to lead into a quotation and embed it into one of your own sentences in a way that's grammatically correct. And then after the quote, you need to follow it up. So here's a little example in this paragraph right here. The ancient Greeks never saw a need to justify wars that were waged outside the walls of the city-state. As Hannah Arendt points out in On Revolution, so look here, we have the name of an author, and we have the name of, I would guess this is a book because it's italicized. If it were an article, it would be in quotation marks. So shorter published pieces are in quotation marks, their titles. Longer, like newspapers, journals, magazines, books, are in italics. So as Hannah Arendt points out in On Revolution, comma, quotation marks, we must turn to Roman antiquity to find the first justification of war, together with the first notion that there are just and unjust wars. Then we have the closing quotation marks. Then we have the page number citation in parentheses, and only then do we have the closing period. So I really want to stress there's a lead in to the quote. Then we have the directly quoted words are within the quotation marks. Then we have the citation after that, and after the parenthetical citation, you have the period. Please note that the writer here doesn't then just leave the quote kind of hanging like, I gave you some words, tra-la-la, moving on. In fact, the writer takes a moment. You got to linger for a moment and kind of talk about the information in the quote. So you got to help make sense of the quotation. So yet the Roman conception of a just war differs sharply from more modern conceptions. So sometimes this way of using a quotation is called the hamburger method because you kind of you have a little bun that comes on the top, and then you have the meat, which is the quote, and then you have a bottom bun that comes on the bottom or afterwards. So you might want to think of it that way, that you are sandwiching your quotations, as it were. So that's with a short quote. Um, but here's the next part I want to talk about. You could, however, strengthen your analysis by demonstrating the significance of the passage within your own argument. Introducing your quotation with a full sentence would help you assert greater control over the material. So there's another way you can set up this quote. The ancient Greeks never saw a need to justify wars that were waged outside the walls of the city-state. In On Revolution, Hannah Arendt points to the role the Romans played in laying the foundation for later thinking about the ethics of waging war, colon. So that's a really good way to set up a quotation. Basically, there's a whole sentence that comes first, and then there's a colon. And after that, we've got the quote. We must turn to Roman antiquity to find the first justification of war, together with the first notion that there are just and unjust wars. And quotation marks, page number citation, period comes outside at the end of everything. Okay? And then there's the follow-up, yet the Roman conception of a just war differs sharply from more modern conceptions. In these two examples, I beseech you, observe the forms of punctuation used to introduce the quotations. So when you introduce a quotation with a full sentence, put a colon at the end of the introductory sentence. And when you introduce a quotation with an incomplete sentence, like just a little lead-in kind of thing, usually place a comma after the introductory phrase. All right, there's one other type of quotation I want to talk to you about, and it is when you use a particularly long quotation. And what we mean by long is more than 4 lines in length. So if your quotation is lengthy, you should almost always introduce it with a full sentence that helps to capture how it fits into your argument. If your quotation is longer than 4 lines, you don't have to put it in quotation marks. What you do is you set it off as a block quotation. And what we mean by block quotation is you indent it. Okay, so here we have the lead-in written by, let's say, a student. Although Dickens never shied away from the political controversies of his time, he never, in Orwell's view, identified himself with any political program, colon. Now, what comes next is the quote. You can see it's a longer quote. You can also see there are no quotation marks. So you just indent it, a tab space. And also notice that it's double spaced, the quote is. And at the end of the quote, strangely, the period comes before the page number citation or the citation. So you just indent it. You don't have to use quotation marks. You still give a citation at the end if necessary. You put the period before it. The full sentence introduction to a block quotation helps demonstrate your grasp of the source material, and it adds analytical depth to your essay. But that introduction alone is not enough. Long quotations almost invariably need to be followed by extended analysis. So if this were in your paper, what they're saying here is, if this were your paper, good for you, you gave it a nice lead in, good for you, you formatted the long quote correctly. But what still needs to happen is you need to follow up the quotation there with some explanation, discussion, and analysis in your own words. So you can also apply that sort of hamburger sandwich method to a long quote. So never allow the quotation to do your work for you. The quote is supporting you. It is not making your point for you. You still have to make your own points. So usually you will want to keep the quotation and your analysis together in the same paragraph. Hence, it is a good idea to avoid ending a paragraph with a quotation. So I really want to stress to you what's very important is that you always embed quotations into your own sentences. Don't just drop a quote in there in between your sentences. You've got to work the quote into something that you've written. So you've got to give it a setup, and then you've always got to follow up quotes. So never end a paragraph with a direct quotation. Okay, I think that's enough. That went longer than I thought. But anyhow, stuff to keep in mind as you are writing.